That's dedication. And you know, for those who've been to JPL or worked there, they're still that dedicated. They just don't have to work as hard to do it. So here are the results. Very low atmospheric pressure around a millibar. Very low temperatures, apparently dry. But these first pictures they get back, they're looking at them saying, oh my God, not only is the empire of Percival Lowell forever dead and smashed to smithereens, but it looks like the moon. Few people were very happy because there were a lot of bets riding on this, and some people made some pretty good money up at JPL and over at some of the academic institutions they were working with because they won the bets that afternoon. But in general, a little disappointing. So bye-bye Frank Frazetta's Mars. We don't have the eight-legged green thoats anymore and all that kind of stuff. But some of these beliefs die hard, you know. As recently as the 80s, there are still people thinking that there were canals and they were full of fish. But even worse, some people just never stop believing. I won't mention any names or anything. Richard Hogan. But you know, the interesting thing about this is the more we explore, the better the cameras get. We're down a matter of feet now. We can see the Mars Phoenix lander rotting away up in the polar area from orbit. The better the observations, the more complicated the conspiracies get. So in the last 10 years, 15 years, the Martians have moved underground. All the cities are underground. They're also on the moon, of course, even though we can see that even better. And NASA's, of course, suppressing evidence because we all know that NASA doesn't want your dollars. They don't want a budget. They want to suppress evidence and not be interesting to anybody. I do a lot of radio, and when you're on AM stations, there's always call-ins, and there's always a caller saying, you know, we never went to the moon. Come on, admit it. And some of them say the same thing about Mars, because I'm usually talking about the Mars book. And I've got a very simple answer for them. And this is not a knock on the French in any way. But the European Space Agency has successfully orbited spacecraft around Mars. They have imaged Mars. They've imaged it very well. Their spacecraft has been very successful. Do you think for a minute that if the French saw something there that we were trying to hide, that they're not going to put it out in the world press in the same afternoon? I think not. So that's my argument. If there was anything being hidden, we'd know about it. So here we are, coming up into the late 60s, early 70s. I just want to put this in because it shows the frequency of launches and the failures. The launches of the maroon, the successful missions are maroon, the failures are the kind of pale pink part, and the Mars game is still, and was then, a tough one. The average success of successful flights was 48%. Now, I was asked a couple of times early on when this first Mars book came out, why did you do the Soviet Union? Does anybody know why I didn't do the Soviet Union? They had a success rate of 11%, and to this day that hasn't changed much. And it's understandable. It's really hard to do. A lot of it's about guidance, control, and computers. The U.S. has a success rate of about 65%, depending on how you call out the numbers. And because of these things, it's been credited to a few people, but I'm pretty sure from the research I've done, a gentleman named John Cassani, who's a very smart engineer at JPL, he's been there since the beginning, came up with the idea of the Great Galactic Ghoul. This is what's snatching all our spacecraft on the way out to Mars. This is just one representation. He was invoked again by Donna Shirley when she was at JPL when they had a couple of mission failures. So it's a very convenient guy to hang your mistakes on. So we're coming up towards 1970, and NASA turns to JPL and says, you know, Mariner was great, we're very excited, and from now on, we're going to have you fly all your probes on the Saturn V. And so Bruce, the other guy, is going, what? This is a case of embarrassing amounts of largesse from your boss, right? This is the Titan. Now, this isn't the Titan III, but it's not very far from being a Titan III. That's the Gemini configuration. That's what they were flying Mars probes on at that time. Here comes NASA saying, we're going to give you a bunch of these because we got to keep the assembly line open. Because they were finishing up the Apollo rockets. There were 20 of those. Still 3 of them lying around the ground. This wasn't something they wanted. NASA was speccing out between 30 and 50,000 pound landers for Mars. Now think of what 30 to 50,000 pounds look like. Curiosity is a little over 2,000 pounds. And it comes up to here, and it's, you know, the size of a small car. So we were talking about landing these fully equipped man-sized labs on the planet of Mars, and it would be a wonderful thing from some perspectives, But being at JPL, they knew the politics of it, what was going to be expected, and that they'd get fewer flights and so forth. So they went into a panic. And as this gentleman, John Cassani, said, the day after this came out, well, Mariner 4 was our last good mission. I think that's a little pessimistic. But as you know, this never happened. Cooler heads prevailed and said, look, we want to go beyond the moon, we want to go to Mars, we want to use the Saturn V for space stations and so forth. So while they were engaging that discussion, this idea went away. Here comes Mariner 6 and 7, a little bigger, a little better in all ways, better cameras, better resolution, way higher data rate, and they're going to fly much closer to Mars. Not a lot to say about this except they're successful and this is the second flyby. And again, a lot of the same results. They were able to, look at the polar caps and infrared and so forth. So there was a lot of good science that came out of it, but it's another flyby. So it's a quick, hi, how you doing, goodbye kind of mission. They did work out a couple of color photos from it, which is, again, one of these things I didn't find until just recently. But they were able to do photography through a couple of filters and extrapolate these colors. Flew by about 2,000 miles away from Mars, which was about cutting the distance in half from Mariner 4. So it was a great step. Now the Soviets are at it again, and they've got these huge ambitious plans for Mars 3, a certain amount of political motivation, not that doesn't happen here as well. But they've now got proton rockets, so they're developing these big, heavy spacecraft. That's about 20,000 pounds, as I recall. Again, pressurized probe. And so that's the Mars 2 and Mars 3 orbiter. That's the Mars 2 and Mars 3 lander. Looks a little bit like a Soyuz, doesn't it? And that's the Mars 3 rover, which doesn't get a lot of press. So Mars 2 entered orbit. This is in 1971. We're sending up Mariner 9. They're sending up these huge things on their big rockets. Mars 2 enters orbit. The lander crashes. The orbiter's still working. Mars 3 enters orbit. The lander soft lands and transmits for like 15 seconds, gets off half of a picture, and then it's done. We never found out why. And of course, the rover didn't work. This was tethered, by the way. It had a 30-foot cable. And it did this kind of hop and jump sort of thing. So it was a really brilliant idea, but unfortunately, it never even got out of the containment area. So this is the same time that we're doing Mariner 9, biggest Mariner yet. And part of that is because you're breaking in orbit, because it was the first to go into orbit around another planet. Now, unfortunately, this trio of spacecraft from two superpowers arrive at Mars within a couple weeks of each other, and what they look down and see is that. It's the biggest dust storm of the century going on Mars, so it's a red billiard ball, There's no features whatsoever. So, fortunately, JPL had been very clever with Mariner. They were able to set up some new commands, reprogram it. They said, okay, wait about 6 weeks, and then we'll let you know. Unfortunately for the Soviets, theirs were not reprogrammable, so they went right ahead and shot all those pictures of that. That's what they got back. So they got back a billiard ball. Mariner delivered 7,300 pictures, better resolution, about 350 feet per pixel. And it's the first time it had been reprogrammed in flight, one of their spacecraft. And for those of you who are computer guys, 512 words, whatever that means in computers, it's not very much. Mapped about 80% of the planet. You see different numbers. That's part of the problem with writing space books is no matter where you look, you're going to see another number, and it's different. I go back to primary sources of NASA. They don't agree. Then, heaven forbid, I go on the internet, and you see everything from soup to nuts. And when you do see the same number in a number of different places, it's usually wrong. I was on Wikipedia the other day looking up some fact. I admit I use it because it's usually pretty accurate. And I thought, oh, these numbers are screwy. Who's this? And I looked down at the citations they'd taken out of my book, so I guess I couldn't say. So, okay. Who is this Schmendrick? So Mariner 9 starts snapping pictures as the storm is clearing. And the guys at JPL and Caltech are standing around. And early on, they see these things. What the heck is that? And it took them a while to realize that I interviewed somebody who was there that day and was talking very, waxing very poetic about the moment they figured out that those were volcanoes. And they were really large volcanoes. And this was the spacecraft that actually changed the name of Nix Olympica to Olympus Mons, the biggest of the volcanoes, biggest volcano in the solar system that we know of, and also discovered Valles Marineris. But now they're starting to see these things. I remember all we see up to this point is the Mariner flyby shots, so we know there's a lot of craters on Mars, but that's about it. And Mariner is doing one swath. As it happened, the first 3 Mariners all looked at heavily cratered regions. They didn't see any kind of dendritic features or water eroded features. So that's what led people to believe Mars is just another moon. It turns out you've got things like this. That's clearly the work of water. That's not wind, and it's probably not volcanic. So now people are getting very, very excited. You start seeing the stuff they call chaotic terrain. You know, there's a lot of interesting geological processes going on there. So now we're getting fascinated with Mars and the spirits being uplifted. And of course, this led to the final planning for Viking, although it was already underway. That's Olympus Mons, and that's about the size of the state of Arizona. So that gives you an idea of how big that is. Big shield volcano. Now, I just want to put this in. I apologize for the graphic because I had to shoot it with my phone out of a book because I couldn't find it anywhere else. But this is out of Bruce Murray's book. And what I thought was fascinating about this was the Soviet launch